Bonjour, Anin Sego. Welcome. Ed Connors, Wabanong Benese, Kabitwe Tang, Wabano Benese, Quequechkan, Tecumseh. I'm Wolf Clan, and I'm from Ganawage, Mohawk Territory, as well as the town of Mount Royal. In addition to what we've spoken about in the past about the ways in which we make peace with one another, we also know that in our cultures have been rich with ways in which to do this, so to make peace with one another. I spoke previously about the wampum belts and how the two-row, the Guswenta, has been important in our creation of relationship, good relationship and friendship, with the attempted efforts to create peace with the Dutch when we first had contact with them. And we had many efforts and attempts to do that in many different ways. But even prior to, as I mentioned, prior to contact, we had already formed many ways to create these good relationships and friendship with one another. A good example of that lies within our Haudenosaunee or our Iroquoian culture. We know that from our history that prior to contact, that we actually had been at war with one another, fighting and in conflict with one another, even though we were of the same cultural background and we shared many different ways and beliefs and practices, values. We still fought with one another, and we know in our history, as it was told, as has been passed to us, that that in time when we were actually fighting with one another and struggling to actually maintain our communities and survive, we had the experience of a person who came from the north. In our language, we refer to him as the Ganawida, and he came with a helper who is referred to as Hiawatha. We don't know exactly who they came from, but we know that they came from the north into our communities. And when they came to our communities, they actually came with teachings about what is today referred to as the Great Law of Peace. That great law was a law that they brought to our 5 nations that were at the time in conflict with one another. And that law was one that over time they shared with all 5 nations, and ultimately our communities acknowledged that there was wisdom within that we could be stronger, as it was said, together than we were separately, and that we would ensure our survival if we were actually to live in peace with one another. And so the Great Law of Peace spoke about that. In fact, even as an example of how that was, there's a teaching that says that we were presented by the Ganawida arrows from a quiver, and we're given 1 arrow and asked to break it, and which was done easily. And then we're given 5 arrows and we're asked to break it, and we could not break the bundle. And the point being that, as one, we were stronger when we worked together as one. And the Great Law was meant to bring us together under one way of understanding relationships with each other, to guide us and to ensure that we lived in peaceful relationship and friendship with one another. And we, out of that, structured what now is today referred to as the Iroquois Confederacy or the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. The Confederacy is based on the Great Law, and it structures our governance with one another such that we can then live together in peace and in harmony, in balance, and in actions that were then meant to bring us together to work as one as opposed to separately. But that's still acknowledged, as we've spoken about before in the understanding of the two-row, that although we came together and worked together as one under the Confederacy, that we also recognized that we had differences. So we respected those differences. There's even differences within our language, although it's a common language. There's many differences that exist, and we respected those differences. So the Great Law was one that actually is symbolized even in this presentation where it speaks to, and part of the teaching of when the great law came, was that when we finally accepted and acknowledged that this was a good way to live, we accepted the great law, and it was said that Deganawida at that time encouraged us to, as he spoke to the Creator, that the Creator then lifted the great white pine tree out of the earth and left a great hole. And in that hole, Deganawida gave us the direction to cast our weapons of war into that hole. And then the Creator placed the great pine upon those weapons of war. And as it was said, that it was symbolized at that time that what that meant was that we would then live in peace and not war with one another. And in the teaching, it speaks to the fact that as those weapons of war were placed below that great white pine, that the great white roots of peace that went out in the four directions from the great white pine tree to reach out to all nations, and that any of the nations that would then see and understand the wisdom of that great law and wish to learn more about it, they were welcome to come and to connect on to our teachings of the great law of peace. So that is what is represented in our symbolism of the actual five nations coming together under the great law of peace, and those great white roots going out in the four directions, inviting those to come and learn if they wish to. It also had, at the top of that great pine was the eagle, and the eagle sat on the top of that great white pine tree as the one who was the messenger to Creator that brought our messages to and the Creator and carried those messages to us. It was said that that great eagle also was placed there by Creator to protect the nations under the great law by being able to look out in all directions and recognize any dangers that were coming towards the nations, and was then meant to help us to recognize those threats that were coming. So in the great law, and with the teachings of the great law, then comes the Confederacy and the understandings of how to live in peace with one another under that law. Today that great law still exists, and we continue to share it and teach it, and we're again, as we've talked about before, relearning the ways in which we had once thought about how to live in peace with one another, with all of creation, and with Creator. So for that, it's helpful, I think, for us to reflect on this kind of teaching as well when we think about our work towards life promotion, and how these kinds of teachings also promoted life in the past and continue to do so today. Miigwech Nyao.